The message had already been sent before Penny realized what she had done. She stared at the small scrap of parchment in her trembling hands. The one Marta had pressed into her palm 3 days ago, whispering, "This is the merchant who owes your brother a debt. Send word if you ever need coin." And then she looked at the sealed letter sitting on the courier's wooden tray, already marked for delivery to the upper ward. The wrong seal. The wrong address. The wrong name entirely. She had copied the address from memory in the dark, by the light of a single dying candle, with a baby crying in the next room, and exhaustion so deep it had turned her fingers clumsy and her thoughts slow as cold honey. She had meant to write to old Corvus, the grain merchant 2 streets below the eastern gate. Instead, the direction on that envelope read, Lord Commander of the Northern Reaches. Warden of the High Pass, Valen of House Draveth. Penny pressed a hand to her mouth. The courier was already gone. She stood in the narrow doorway of the cottage she had been borrowing from a woman named Elspeth, a widow who asked no questions and expected payment in firewood, and felt the night air settle cold against her bare arms. The village of Ashfen was quiet at this hour. Somewhere beyond the tree line, an owl called once and went silent. The baby, little Rowan, had finally fallen asleep in the cot by the hearth, wrapped in a shawl that was too thin for the season. Penny had written exactly 3 sentences in that letter. I have nothing left to feed the child. I cannot pay what I owe. Please, if there is any mercy left in this kingdom, send what you can. 3 sentences, addressed to the most powerful Lycan lord in the northern half of the realm. She pressed her forehead against the doorframe and laughed, and the sound that came out of her was quiet and slightly broken, the kind of laugh that lives very close to weeping. She had not always lived like this. That was the part that still surprised her, even now, the speed of the fall. 8 months ago, Penny had been the lawfully wedded wife of Lord Aldrich Fenmore, second son of the Fenmore bloodline, a man with a respectable holding near the River Cale, a man who had smiled at her across a feast table and told her she was the most sensible woman he had ever met. She had taken that as a compliment. She understood now that it had been a warning. Aldrich had wanted a sensible wife, one who would not ask questions, one who would manage his household, smile at his guests, and look the other way while he conducted business that did not bear scrutiny. She had been sensible, right up until the night she found the letters. Aldrich had kept them in a locked cedar box beneath his writing desk, correspondence with a man named Corvin Strake, who served as steward to Lord Fenmore the Elder. The letters were detailed, practical, and utterly without remorse. They discussed her dowry in columns. They referenced a clause in the marriage contract that Penny had never been shown. They outlined, in calm merchant's language, a plan to have her declared mentally unfit within the year, strip her of any claim to the Fenmore property she had brought into the marriage, including the mill and the woodland her father had left her, and have her quietly removed to a house of penitent sisters in the far south, where she would have no recourse and no witnesses. There had been a postscript in Aldrich's handwriting, added at the bottom of the most recent letter. The child complicates things. We'll discuss when you arrive. The child. Rowan had been 5 weeks old. Penny had not been sensible after that. She had been fast. She had taken the letters, taken Rowan, taken the small tin of coin she kept behind the loose stone in the kitchen hearth, and she had walked out of Fenmore House in the middle of the night, through the servants' entrance, across the wet grass, and into a darkness so complete she could not see her own feet. She had not looked back. She told herself she had not looked back, because there was nothing worth seeing. She almost believed it. Ashfen was 3 days' travel from the Fenmore lands, which meant it was far enough that Aldrich's men had not yet found her, but not so far that she felt safe. She had arrived with a feverish baby, wet boots, and enough coin to last 2 weeks if she ate sparingly. That had been 4 months ago. The coin was gone. The fever had passed. Rowan was healthy now, small and dark-eyed and entirely unaware that his existence had been reduced to a problem to be managed. Penny fed him as best she could, trading mending work and herb drying for Elspeth in exchange for shelter. But the village had little to spare, and winter was sharpening its teeth. The merchant Corvus had loaned her brother coin once, years ago, and her brother Emmett, who was currently being held at the Fenmore estate, she was nearly certain of it, though she had no proof, had mentioned the name. She had thought, in her desperation, that perhaps the debt could be called in. Perhaps there was still some thread of the old world she could pull. Instead, she had sent a begging letter to the warden of the High Pass. Penny went back inside and sat beside the hearth, pulling Rowan's cot a little closer. The fire was down to coals. She did not add wood. There were only 4 pieces left, and the night was long. She told herself the letter would simply go unanswered. A lord of that rank did not personally read correspondence from unknown women in small villages. It would be intercepted by a steward, discarded, possibly used to light someone else's fire. She would be forgotten before sunrise. She told herself this and almost believed it. The knock came at midnight. Not a pounding knock. Not the kind Aldrich's men used when they wanted to remind you of their authority. This was 3 measured strikes against the wooden door, deliberate, unhurried, and somehow more alarming than any shouting could have been. Penny rose slowly. She wrapped the shawl around her shoulders and picked up the fire iron from beside the hearth, because she was sensible, and sense in this world meant never opening a door without something solid in your hand. She opened it 2 inches. Cold air rushed in, carrying pine resin and the clean, sharp smell of snow that had not yet fallen. The man on the other side of the door was not a messenger. He was tall enough that the low door frame would have been a problem for him had he stepped forward, which he did not. He wore a dark riding cloak, plain but heavy, and beneath it the kind of clothing that had seen real weather, not the decorative riding costume of a lord performing outdoors, but the practical layered wool of someone who lived in cold places and expected to keep living in them. His hair was dark and somewhat disordered from the ride. His eyes, catching the faint coal light from the hearth behind her, were a color she could not immediately name. Something between gray and the deep green of river water under cloud cover. He looked at the fire iron in her hand. He did not step back. He did not smile. He simply waited, with the particular stillness of someone who was not accustomed to being made to wait, but had decided, for reasons of his own, that this time he would. "You sent me a letter," he said. His voice was low and even. Not warm, exactly, but not cold either. Simply present, the way a large stone in a river is present. You navigate around it without resenting it. Penny's grip on the fire iron tightened. "I sent a letter to Corvus the grain merchant," she said. "You are not him." "No," he agreed. "I am not." A breath of silence. Rowan stirred in the cot behind her, made a soft sound, and settled again. She watched the man's eyes move toward the sound and come back to her face, and she could not read what passed through them in that moment. "You wrote that you had nothing left to feed the child," he said. Penny said nothing. "I brought grain," he said, "and dried milk, and 2 blankets, because the rider who came ahead said the cottage had 1 hearth, and the woodpile was low." He paused. "I left them on the step. You don't have to let me in." Penny looked down. There was a crate on the step that she had not noticed in her alarm. Beside it, a cloth bundle and 2 folded blankets in undyed wool, thick as a winter coat. She looked back up at him. "Why?" she said. It was the only word she had. The man, who was apparently Valen of House Draveth, warden of the High Pass, looked at her for a long moment with those river-gray eyes. "You asked," he said simply, as though that were the only answer required. Penny did not let him in. She told herself it was caution. She told herself that a woman alone, in a borrowed cottage, with a sleeping infant and a fire iron and no witnesses, did not simply open her door to a strange man in the middle of the night, regardless of what he had brought or what he claimed his name to be. She told herself all of this, while she dragged the crate inside with one arm, keeping the door at a careful angle, and then reached out for the cloth bundle and the blankets without ever fully releasing her grip on the iron. He watched her do all of this without comment. When she had everything inside, she straightened and looked at him through the narrow gap. "You rode from the high pass tonight," she said. It was not a question. The high pass was nearly half a day's journey, even on a good road, even in daylight. It was the middle of the night, and the roads in this season were neither good nor lit. "I did," he said, "because of a letter from a woman you don't know." "Because of a letter that asked for help," he said. "There is a difference." Penny studied him. She was good at reading people, or she had thought she was, once, before Aldrich had dismantled that confidence thoroughly. She looked for the things that liars carried without knowing it. The slight over-stillness of someone performing calm, the eyes that moved a fraction too quickly, the jaw that held too much tension. She looked for the shape of a man who wanted something he had not yet named. She found none of those things. What she found instead was harder to categorize. A quality of patience that did not feel like strategy, and a directness that did not feel like aggression. He simply stood in the cold and looked at her, and seemed entirely prepared to keep doing so for as long as she required. "I don't know you," she said finally. "No," he agreed. "I have no reason to trust you." Also accurate. "Then why are you still standing there?" He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the pine trees at the edge of the cottage yard, a long, low sound that Penny had come to associate with Ashvin at night, restless and cold and indifferent. "Because you haven't asked me to leave," he said. She closed the door. She stood with her back against it in the dark and listened to the coal light breathe behind her. And Rowan's small, steady sleeping sounds, and the wind outside, and nothing else. No retreating footsteps. No sound of a horse being turned around. She opened the door again. He was still there. "There is a tavern at the north end of the village," she said. "Elspeth's cousin keeps it. It is not much, but it is warmer than the road." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "I know it," he said. "I'll go." He turned to leave. She did not know what made her speak again. Exhaustion, probably, or the particular loneliness of 4 months of silence. "Thank you," she said, "for the grain and the blankets." He paused without turning around. "Sleep," he said. "The rest can wait until morning." She did not sleep. She sat beside the hearth with one of the new blankets wrapped around her shoulders and the crate open at her feet, cataloging its contents with the methodical attention of someone who understood that survival was mostly arithmetic. There was enough dried grain for 3 weeks if she was careful. The dried milk was good quality, the kind that came from a lord's stores, not a market stall. There were also, tucked beneath the cloth wrapping of the bundle, a small jar of honey, a twist of paper containing salt, and a handful of dried herbs that she recognized as the kind used in restorative broths. Someone had packed this carefully. Someone who knew what a woman alone with an infant actually needed, as opposed to what looked generous from a distance. Penny sat with the jar of honey in her hands for a long time. She thought about Aldrich. She thought about the cedar box and the letters and the postscript. The child complicates things, and the way he had said it, as though Rowan were a ledger entry that had come out wrong. She thought about Emmett, her brother, who had been visiting Fenmore House when she fled, and who she had not been able to reach since. She had sent 3 messages through trusted hands, and received nothing back. The silence where Emmett's voice should have been was the loudest thing in her life. She thought about the man standing in the cold with a crate of supplies, and no visible expectation of reward, and she did not know what to do with that. She put the honey carefully back in the crate and went to check on Rowan. He came back in the morning. Penny heard the knock and recognized it. 3 measured strikes, the same as before, and felt something strange happen in her chest. Not warmth, exactly. More like the cautious recognition of a pattern. She opened the door with the fire iron in her hand out of habit, and he looked at it with the same non-expression as the night before. "Old habit," she said, and set it against the wall. "Wise one," he said. The daylight was not kind to Ashvin. It revealed the mud, the patched roofs, the general exhaustion of a village that had endured 2 hard winters in a row. But it was kind enough to him. He looked less like a shadow and more like a person in the morning light. She could see the detail of the gray threading through his dark hair at the temples, the slight weathering around his eyes, the kind of face that had spent years outdoors and showed it without apology. He was older than she had initially judged. Not old, but past the age of performing youth for anyone's benefit. He held 2 cups from the tavern, steam rising from both. "There is something they are calling tea," he said, "though I have questions about its origins. May I come in?" Penny stepped back from the door. He entered slowly, with the careful deliberateness of someone aware of his own size in a small space, and looked around the cottage with an attention that was not intrusive but was thorough. His eyes moved across the single room, the cot, the hearth, the mended curtains, the stack of Elspeth's unfinished sewing on the table. And Penny had the uncomfortable sensation of being understood without being spoken to. He set 1 cup on the table and kept the other, and remained standing, because there was only 1 chair, and Penny had not offered it. "I need to know something," she said. She wrapped both hands around the cup. The warmth was immediate and real. "How did you know which village?" The letter had no direction, only a name. "The courier's route," he said. "He keeps a log. Ashvin was the only stop in this area." "And you came yourself, not a steward, not a messenger?" "Yes." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, looking not at her but at the window, where pale winter light pressed through the oiled cloth that served in place of glass. "The letter said if there is any mercy left in this kingdom," he said. "That is not a phrase a person writes easily. It means they have already looked for mercy in every place they expected to find it." Penny said nothing. Her throat had done something inconvenient. "I wanted to know," he said, who had run out of places to look. She told him some of it. Not all. She was not ready for all of it, and she was not certain she would ever be ready to give the full accounting to a stranger, no matter how he packed a supply crate. But she told him enough. The marriage, the letters in the cedar box, the flight, Emmett. When she mentioned Emmett's name and the silence that had replaced him, something changed in Valen's expression. It was not pity. She would have closed like a door against pity. It was attention. The specific quality of attention that meant information was being received and processed, rather than simply heard and discarded. "Emmett Calloway," she said. "He was staying at Fenmore House as a guest when I left. He should have been able to leave freely. He had no quarrel with the Fenmores. But he hasn't written. Not once, in 4 months." Valen set down his cup. "Fenmore," he said slowly. "The elder lord, or the second son." "The second son. Aldrich. Aldrich Fenmore." He said it the way one says a name that is already connected to other names in one's memory. "He attended the last Lord's Council. I remember him." Penny looked up. "What do you remember?" "That he spoke very little," Valen said, "and listened very carefully, and that he left early, before the vote on the Northern Grain Levy." He paused. "He voted no, by proxy, on a levy that would have benefited the villages along the Kale River, including the mill settlements. Penny's mill, her father's mill, which was now technically Aldrich's, because she had signed the inheritance transfer as part of the marriage agreement without understanding what she was signing. The honey-colored thing she had been trying not to feel since last night curdled into something colder. "He came to that council," she said quietly, "while I was 3 months along and barely able to keep food down, and he voted against the mill levy. Yes, because the mill was already his by then." Valen looked at her steadily. "It would appear so." Rowan woke up then, announcing himself with the particular indignant cry of a baby who had slept as long as he intended to, and considered further negotiation unnecessary. Penny rose and went to him, lifting him against her shoulder, and turning so that her face was hidden for a moment while she composed it. When she turned back, Valen was still standing in the same place, giving her the privacy of his stillness. "I need to find my brother," she said. Her voice was level. She had made it level. "And I need to understand what Aldrich actually has, and what he only thinks he has. Because if my father's mill was transferred under false pretenses, there may be a challenge to be made." "There may," Valen said carefully. "I am not asking you to fight my battles," she said, and meant it. "I am not asking you for anything more than you have already given. But if you know the law of this kingdom regarding fraudulent inheritance transfers—" "I do," he said. "Then I would like to know it too." He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that took stock without condescending. And then he pulled out the chair at the table and sat down, as though he had just decided to stay a while. "Then sit," he said. "This will take some time to explain properly." Penny sat. Rowan settled against her, small and warm and quietly interested in the ceiling. Outside, Ashvin went about its morning, indifferent and cold. And inside the borrowed cottage with its dying fire and its thin walls, something began that Penny could not yet name. Not trust, not quite, but the tentative and extraordinary sensation of not being entirely alone. The law, as Valen explained it, was both simpler and more complicated than Penny had hoped. She sat across from him at the narrow table with Rowan balanced on her knee, and listened while he laid out the structure of inheritance law in the northern kingdoms, with the same calm precision he seemed to apply to everything. No flourish, no condescension, simply the facts arranged in order of relevance. A marriage transfer of inherited land could be challenged if it could be demonstrated that the signing party had not received full disclosure of what was being transferred, or if the transfer had been witnessed by parties with a conflict of interest. Both conditions, he explained, would need documentation. "The letters," Penny said immediately, "if you still have them." She had them. She had carried them folded inside Rowan's blanket the entire journey from Fenmore House, which was either the most practical decision she had ever made, or evidence that some part of her had already known she would need them. She retrieved them now from the inner pocket of her traveling bag, still wrapped in the oilcloth she had taken from Aldrich's own desk, and set them on the table. Valen unfolded them carefully. He read without expression, or nearly without expression. Once, near the bottom of the second letter, something moved briefly across his face that she could not name before it was gone again. When he finished, he refolded them along their original creases and set them back on the table. "These are sufficient," he said. "Corvin Strake's name and seal on the correspondence, combined with your account of the unsigned clause, would be enough to bring a formal challenge before the Lord's Council." "Would be," Penny said. "Or will be." He met her eyes. "That depends on whether you are willing to bring the challenge publicly. It would require you to appear before the council. It would require Aldrich to be present. It would put your name, and Rowan's, into the formal record of a disputed inheritance. He would know where I am. Yes." Rowan grabbed a fistful of her sleeve and pulled, as he did when he was deciding whether to be hungry. Penny freed her sleeve gently and thought about Aldrich's hands, how they had always been slightly too controlled, fingers never quite loose, always the suggestion of something held back. She thought about the postscript. The child complicates things. He already has men looking, she said. I know he does. 4 months is a long time, and Aldrich is not a patient man when something he considers his has gone missing. She paused. He doesn't want me back because he loves me. He wants me back because I took the letters. And because a wife who has fled is a complication of her own kind, Valen said, one that invites questions. So he is already motivated to find me. She looked at the oilcloth packet on the table. Running has bought me time, not safety. No, he agreed. It has not. The fire had burned low again. Penny noticed it the way she always did now, with a small internal calculation, wood versus cold versus time. And then noticed that Valen had also noticed it, because he rose without comment and added 2 logs from the pile by the door. He did it the way he did most things, without making a production of it, without waiting to be thanked. She watched him do it, and felt the strange discomfort of being cared for by someone she did not yet know how to receive. He did not leave that day. He did not intrude either. He sent word to the tavern for a proper meal to be brought over. Actual food. A pot of stew with root vegetables and barley. Bread that was still warm. And while Penny fed Rowan, and then fed herself with the focused gratitude of someone who had been eating sparingly for months, Valen sat at the table and wrote. He had asked Elspeth's permission to use the cottage for the afternoon, which Penny found out later because Elspeth appeared at the door mid-morning with a look on her face that combined deep curiosity and profound respect in equal measure, mumbled something about firewood, and retreated. "What are you writing?" Penny asked. "Letters," he said, "to people who owe me information. About Aldrich? About Aldrich. About Corvin Strake, whose name I recognize from other contexts. And about your brother." Penny went still. "You think you can find out about Emmett?" "I think I have people who can ask questions that I cannot ask directly without alerting Fenmore." He set down his quill. "The Fenmore holding is not under my jurisdiction. It falls under Lord Cassell's territory in the south. But information moves freely enough if you know where to send for it." "Why are you doing this?" She had asked it before. She was asking it again because the first answer, while honest, had not entirely satisfied her. "You don't know me. You have no obligation. You are the warden of the High Pass. You have an entire territory to govern. You rode half a day in the dark for a letter from a stranger." Valen looked at her for a moment, with those gray-green eyes that she was beginning to understand, did not rush to fill silence. "My mother," he said finally, "left a bad marriage when I was 4 years old. She walked out of a house that was better than this one, with less than you had, and no letters to prove anything." He paused. "She did not survive the first winter. The cottage was very quiet." "I'm sorry," Penny said, and meant it without performance. "It was a long time ago," he said, "but I remember what she looked like in doorways, always calculating whether she could afford to step through them." He picked up his quill again. "You hold a fire iron when you open the door. She used to keep a kitchen knife in her apron pocket. Some things I recognize." Penny did not say anything. There was nothing to say that would not have been insufficient. She looked down at Rowan, who had fallen asleep against her collarbone with the absolute confidence of someone who had never once doubted his right to be held. And she thought that this was what she was fighting for. Not the mill, not her name, not even justice, though she wanted all of those things. She was fighting for the right to be a doorway her son could step through without fear. The messenger arrived on the 3rd day. Penny saw him from the window, a rider in Fenmore colors, the dull ochre and brown of the Fenmore house standard, moving slowly through the village asking questions of anyone who would answer. Her blood went cold in the specific way it did when a fear that had been theoretical became actual. She stepped back from the window. "He's here," she said. "A Fenmore rider." Valen was on his feet before she finished the sentence. Not with alarm. He didn't move with alarm. She was beginning to understand, but with immediate and decisive attention. He crossed to the window, looked out, and turned back to her. "Pack what you need," he said. "Only what you can carry quickly." "Where?" "The tavern has a back entrance to the stable. My horses are there. We leave before he works his way to this end of the village. Elspeth, I will send her coin and an explanation." He was already moving toward the door. "She will not be harmed. A Fenmore rider has no authority here, and he will not risk creating a scene in a public village without proof you're present." He paused at the door and looked back at her. "But proof is what he's looking for, so let's not give him any." Penny had Rowan wrapped and the bag packed in 4 minutes. The letters were in her inner pocket. She did not take the honey. There was no room. And she felt a foolish pang about it that she immediately dismissed. They went out through the back of the cottage, through Elspeth's kitchen garden, through a gap in the wattle fence that Penny had noticed weeks ago and filed away as a potential exit route out of the same habit that made her sleep facing the door. She led, and Valen followed, which felt strange, and then felt right. This was her village, her escape route, her calculation. The tavern stable smelled of horse and hay, and the particular warmth of large animals and cold air. 2 horses were ready, which meant he had anticipated this, or something close to it. The sight of that preparation, the readied horses, the packed saddlebags, the evidence of a contingency she hadn't known was in place, hit her somewhere between gratitude and a deep unsteadiness, because she was not accustomed to someone planning for her survival as though it mattered. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Yes." It had been months, but yes. He helped her mount without making it a question, with Rowan secured against her chest in the carrying wrap she had fashioned from a length of wool. She settled into the saddle and found her balance and looked down at him. He was still on the ground, checking the girth strap with the same methodical attention he gave everything. "Where are we going?" she asked. He looked up at her. "North," he said. "To the high pass, to my hall." He held her gaze steadily, not asking for trust, but also not pretending she owed it. "You will be safe there. Fenmore has no reach in my territory. None." Penny thought about that for exactly the time it took the Fenmore rider to appear at the far end of the village street, visible through a gap in the stable wall. Still questioning, still searching. "North," she said. "All right." He mounted, and they rode, and the village of Ashfen disappeared behind them into the gray morning, and Penny kept her eyes forward and her arms around Rowan, and told herself that moving toward something unknown was still better than being found by something she already knew. She told herself this, and for the first time in 4 months, she almost did not need to convince herself. The high pass revealed itself slowly, the way serious things often do. For the first hour of riding, the landscape was simply winter. Bare fields, frost-stiffened hedgerows, the occasional farmstead with smoke rising thin and straight into colorless sky. Then the road began to climb, and the trees changed, pines replacing the scattered oaks of the lowlands, growing denser and darker and taller until they pressed close on both sides, and the sound of the horses' hooves became something muffled and intimate. Then the trees thinned again, and the land opened into a high plateau, and there, at the far end of it, was Draveth Hall. It was not a castle in the way that word implied grandeur and excess. It was a fortress that had been built by people who understood cold, long and low, and made of dark stone that had weathered into the landscape so completely it looked as though it had grown there rather than been constructed. The walls were thick. The towers were practical rather than ornamental. Smoke rose from multiple hearths, and the smell of it, pine wood, clean and sharp, reached her before they crossed the outer gate. Penny had expected something imposing. She had not expected something that felt, against all reason, like shelter. The household received them without ceremony, which she was grateful for. A woman named Greta, broad-shouldered, gray-haired, with the manner of someone who had been running this hall since before Valen was born and intended to continue doing so indefinitely, appeared at the entrance and looked Penny over once with sharp, intelligent eyes, looked at Rowan, and made an immediate series of decisions that Penny was not consulted about, but could not object to because they were all correct. A room was prepared. A bath was brought. Hot food arrived without being requested. A cradle appeared from somewhere in the depths of the hall, solid old oak with a worn patina, and was placed beside the hearth in Penny's room with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who did not consider this remarkable. Penny sat on the edge of the bed after Greta left and looked at the room around her. The thick walls, the heavy curtains, the cradle that someone had once used and kept and now offered to a stranger's child, and felt something inside her chest release that she had not known she was holding. She did not weep. She was too tired to weep. She simply sat and breathed and let the warmth of the room settle into her bones like something medicinal. The information about Emmett arrived on the 5th day. Valen brought it to her himself, which told her something before he spoke a word, because a man who sent a servant with good news and came himself with difficult news was a man who understood what difficult news required. She was in the small solar off the main hall, a room with a window that faced east and enough light for sewing, which Greta had identified as something to keep her hands busy while her mind worked. Rowan was in the cradle nearby, fascinated by a strip of ribbon that Penny had tied to the hood above him. Valen sat across from her without preamble. "My man found him," he said. "Is he alive?" The question came out before she could arrange it into something less raw. "He is alive." A pause, careful and deliberate. "He is being held at Fenmore House, not as a declared prisoner. There is no formal charge against him, but the household accounts show his name on the guest ledger as a continued resident, which after 4 months of unbroken stay against a man's known character suggests he is not there by choice." Penny set down the sewing. "Aldrich is holding him as leverage. That is my assessment. Emmett is known as your closest relation. With your parents gone and no other family of standing, he is the most effective means of drawing you out or ensuring your silence." "He would not harm him," she said, and then immediately heard the uncertainty in her own voice. She said it again, differently. "He would not harm him without cause. Emmett has done nothing. Harming him without provocation would create precisely the kind of attention Aldrich is trying to avoid." "I agree," Valen said. "For now, Emmett is more valuable as a held card than as a consequence. But that calculation changes if you move against Aldrich legally." "Then I need to move against him before he realizes I'm moving," she said. Valen looked at her with that particular quality of attention she had come to recognize. The kind that meant he was reassessing something he had already assessed. "Yes," he said. "Exactly that." She picked the sewing back up. Her hands were steadier than she expected. "Tell me what you have already set in motion," she said, "because I don't believe you have been simply waiting." A beat of silence. Then, "No, I have not been simply waiting." He had, she discovered over the next hour, been doing considerably more than waiting. He had contacted Lord Castle, in whose territory the Fenmore holding lay, with a carefully worded inquiry about the status of certain inheritance transfers registered in the past year. He had requested, through an intermediary, a copy of the Lord's Council attendance records for the session Aldrich had left early. He had sent word to the council's chief scribe, an old man named Baron, apparently a figure of unimpeachable exactitude, requesting clarification on the proper witnessing requirements for marital land transfers, framed as a general legal question rather than a specific challenge. "You have been building a case," Penny said. "I have been gathering material," he corrected. "The case is yours to build. I did not want to act beyond what you had authorized." She looked at him. "I authorized you to explain inheritance law to me over tavern tea of questionable origin." "Yes," he said, "and everything I have done since falls within the reasonable interpretation of that conversation." She almost laughed. It surprised her, the nearness of laughter, which had felt very far away for a very long time. She did not quite let it happen, but she felt it, which was something. "What do you need from me?" she said. "Your formal testimony, written and sealed. The letters, copied, and the originals held in trust. And your agreement to appear before the Lord's Council when the time comes." He paused. "There is also the question of standing. Standing. A woman challenging an inheritance transfer requires a sponsor of sufficient rank to present the challenge on her behalf, unless she holds a title of her own." He said it evenly, without apology, because it was simply the law, and apologizing for the law was a different conversation. "You do not currently hold a title." "I held the mill," she said. "My father's mill, which is the asset in dispute. It cannot serve as its own foundation." He looked at her steadily. "I can serve as your sponsor. I have sufficient standing. The council cannot refuse to hear a challenge brought under the warden's seal." The room was quiet, except for Rowan's small sounds and the distant noise of the hall beyond the closed door. Footsteps, a voice giving instruction, the ordinary texture of a household going about its day. "That would publicly associate you with my challenge," Penny said. "With me, with a disputed inheritance and a runaway wife, and a child of uncertain formal status." She kept her voice neutral, because she wanted his answer without the pressure of her own reaction on it. "That has political consequences for you." "It does," he agreed. "Aldrich has allies on the council. 3 that I know of. I have 7. That is not an insurmountable majority." "No, but it is a working one." He held her gaze. "I am not doing this without understanding the weight of it, Penny. I want to be clear about that. I know what it costs. I have considered it." She had asked him why twice before, and gotten answers that were true but incomplete. She did not ask again now. She looked at him, at the steadiness of him, the absence of performance, the way he had come himself in the middle of the night with a crate of supplies and never once made her feel like a debt being accrued. And she thought that some questions were answered not by words, but by accumulated evidence. "All right," she said. "Then I accept your sponsorship, and I will write the testimony tonight." He nodded once, as though this had been agreed, and was now simply a matter of execution. He rose to leave. "Valen." She said his name for the first time without thinking about it, and felt the slight strangeness of it on her tongue. He paused. "When this is over, when Emmett is free and the mill is settled, I want to be present when Aldrich answers for it, not hidden in an anteroom, not represented only by proxy." She met his eyes. "I want to be in that hall." He looked at her for a long moment with something in his expression that was not surprise exactly, but was close to recognition. The look of someone seeing a thing confirmed that they had already suspected. "You will be," he said. "I'll make certain of it." The testimony took her most of the night to write. She wrote it at the table in her room by candlelight, with Rowan sleeping in the oak cradle and the fire burning steadily at her back. She wrote carefully, precisely, without embellishment, because she understood instinctively that the power of this document lay in its plainness. She described the cedar box. She described the letters. She described the clause she had not been shown. She described the witnesses at her marriage signing, naming each one and noting their relationship to the Fenmore household. She described the postscript. When she reached "the child complicates things," she stopped for a moment and looked at Rowan. He was sleeping on his back, with his arms flung wide in the absolute physical confidence of the very young, his dark lashes against his cheek, his small chest rising and falling. She dipped the quill and kept writing. By the time the candle had burned to its last inch, she had 12 pages in a clear, even hand, and she had remembered things she had not known she remembered. Small details, dates, overheard conversations, the name of the notary who had witnessed the transfer and whose brother, she now recalled, was employed in the Fenmore stables. Details that individually meant little, and together meant everything. She sealed the document with the plain wax she had been given, and held it in both hands for a moment. Then she set it on the table, blew out the candle, and slept. Truly slept, deeply and without dreaming, for the first time in 4 months. The Lord's Council convened on a morning when the sky was the color of pewter and the wind came down from the mountains with serious intent. Penny wore the dress Greta had altered for her, deep gray wool, simply cut, with a collar of darker charcoal that Greta had added without being asked, because, as she said with characteristic efficiency, a woman walking into that hall needed to look like she belonged in it. Her hair was dressed plainly, pinned back without ornament. She carried nothing in her hands. She had decided, after some thought, that walking into a room full of powerful men with nothing to hold was more deliberate than walking in armed, because it said she required nothing external to stand upright. Rowan was with Greta, who had informed Penny that morning with absolute certainty that the child would be perfectly well and that she had raised 4 of her own and knew what she was doing, and Penny had believed her and felt the complicated particular relief of trusting someone with something irreplaceable. Valen walked beside her through the corridor that led to the council hall. He did not offer his arm. He had understood, she thought, that she did not want to arrive looking as though she needed to be escorted. He simply walked at the same pace, close enough that she was aware of him, far enough that the space between them was hers. "Aldrich is already inside," he said quietly. "I know." She had seen the Fenmore horses in the yard, ochre and brown, dull as old mud. "Corvin Strake is with him. Lord Cassell is presiding. He is not friendly to Fenmore, but he is cautious, so he will follow procedure exactly." "Good," she said. "Procedure is all I need." Valen glanced at her sidelong. "You're not afraid?" It was not quite a question. She considered it honestly. "I am," she said. "But it's a useful kind of afraid, the kind that makes you think clearly." He said nothing. But something in his expression settled into a quality she had come to associate specifically with moments when she said something he had not expected. A slight deepening of attention, as though he were filing it away. She pushed open the door to the council hall and walked in. Aldrich looked up when she entered, and the expression that crossed his face lasted only a fraction of a second before he controlled it. But she saw it, and she memorized it, and she set it aside for later like a letter to be reread. It was not anger. It was not guilt. It was the specific expression of a man whose calculation has just been disrupted by a variable he thought he had eliminated. She sat in the chair that had been placed for her across the long table and looked at him without flinching. And he looked at her with the controlled surface of a man who knew he was being watched. And between them, the 12 pages of her testimony sat in Valen's hands like a stone that had not yet been thrown. Lord Cassell, a lean man of 60 with careful eyes, called the session to order with the formal language required. He stated the nature of the challenge. He acknowledged the sponsoring warden's seal. He confirmed the presence of both parties and invited the documentary evidence to be entered into the record. Valen presented the letters first. He read Corvin Strake's words aloud, and the council hall was very quiet while he did. The language of those letters, the columns of figures, the references to the unsigned clause, the discussion of the House of Penitent Sisters, landed differently when spoken aloud in a formal chamber than they had on paper in a dark cottage. They landed with the full weight of what they were. A written record of a conspiracy against a woman conducted in the comfortable certainty that she would never see the inside of a room like this one. Corvin Strake, seated beside Aldrich, had gone the color of old ash. Aldrich himself showed almost nothing, which was its own kind of telling. Then Valen read the postscript. The child complicates things. He read it once, in the same even tone he had used for everything else, without editorial comment, and set the letter down. Two of the council lords shifted in their seats. One, an older man with a gray beard, looked at Aldrich with an expression that was not quite contempt, but had contempt's address. Penny spoke when it was her turn. She had prepared what she would say, had revised it in her mind a dozen times during the ride to the council seat, had stripped it of everything that was not necessary. She stated the facts in the order she had written them. She did not raise her voice. She did not appeal to sympathy. She presented the timeline, the names, the dates, the notary whose brother worked Fenmore stables, the absence of disclosure regarding the clause, the absence of independent witnesses at the transfer signing. When she reached the part about Emmett, she looked directly at Lord Cassell. "My brother has been a continuous resident at Fenmore House for 4 months, she said. He is a free man with no charge against him and no declared reason for remaining. I ask this council to include in its proceedings a formal inquiry into the circumstances of his continued presence there." Aldrich's composure cracked, finally, not dramatically, just a tightening around the jaw, a barely perceptible shift of weight. It was enough. Lord Cassell noted the request in the record without looking at Aldrich. The deliberation lasted the better part of the afternoon. Penny waited in an antechamber with a cup of something warm and the company of her own thoughts, which were not peaceful, but were organized. She thought about her father, who had built the mill himself over 3 seasons, and who had believed, genuinely and without irony, that a thing you built with your own hands belonged to you in a way that law only confirmed rather than created. She thought about what he would have said about all of this, and decided he would have said something practical and short, and then gone back to work. Valen came to the antechamber once briefly. He stood in the doorway and looked at her and said, "Cassell has sent for the notary," which meant the council had found the testimony credible enough to investigate further, which meant the formal challenge would proceed. "And Emmett?" she said. "A rider has already been dispatched to the Fenmore holding with a council writ." He held her gaze. "He will be out within the week." Penny set down the cup carefully and looked at her own hands for a moment. "Thank you," she said. It was entirely inadequate and entirely genuine. "You did this," he said. "I provided the room. You filled it." She looked up at him then, really looked, with the same assessment she had applied on the first night when she had searched his face for the shape of a liar and found something else entirely. 4 weeks had passed since that midnight knock. She knew now the way he took his meals, standing half the time because he thought better on his feet. She knew he visited the stables each morning before anything else, not from obligation, but from something closer to affection for the animals in his care. She knew he had a younger sister in the South whom he wrote to weekly. She knew that the gray in his hair had appeared, according to Greta, the winter after his mother's death, when he was 19, and had taken on the wardenship earlier than anyone had expected or prepared him for. She knew that he had ridden half a day in the dark for a letter from a stranger, and that when she asked him why, his answer had been "You asked," as though that were the most natural reason in the world. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. "When I opened the door that first night," she said carefully, "I was looking for every reason not to trust you. I was very prepared to find them." "I know," he said. "I didn't find them." "I know that too." The antechamber was small, and the afternoon light through the single window was thin and pale, and Penny thought that this was perhaps the least romantic setting that had ever existed, and that it didn't matter at all. "I don't know what this is," she said, because she was, at her core, a person who preferred honesty to elegance. "I know that you have been, that what you've done has been. I'm not able to repay it, and I'm not willing to pretend that what I feel is simple gratitude, because it isn't, but I also don't know how to." "Penny," he said quietly. She stopped. "You don't have to name it today," he said. "It will still be there tomorrow, and the day after." She breathed. "You're very certain of that?" "Yes," he said simply. "I am." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she nodded, once, and something between them settled into a new and different shape. Not resolved, not concluded, but grounded. Real in the way that things are real when they have been earned rather than assumed. The council's formal ruling came 6 days later. The inheritance transfer was declared invalid on the grounds of material non-disclosure and improperly witnessed documentation. The mill and the associated woodland were restored to Penny's name. Aldrich Fenmore was formally censured and barred from future Lords' Council attendance, pending a broader review of the Fenmore Holdings registered transfers. A review that, Lord Cassell's accompanying letter made clear, would be thorough. Corvin Strake resigned his stewardship the same day the ruling was announced. Emmett arrived at Draveth Hall 3 days after that, thinner than Penny remembered, and quieter in ways that would take time to understand, but alive and upright, and standing in the courtyard with the expression of a man who had not entirely believed he would get out until the moment he did. Penny walked out to meet him, and they stood in the cold for a moment just looking at each other. And then she put her arms around him, and he put his around her, and they stayed that way for a long time, without saying anything. Because there are reunions that words can only interrupt. When they finally separated, Emmett looked past her at the hall, and then at Valen, who had appeared in the doorway at a respectful distance. "That's him?" Emmett said quietly. "Yes," Penny said. Emmett was quiet for a moment. "He's very large," he observed. "He is," she agreed. "Is he good to you?" Penny thought about midnight crates and firewood and 12-page testimonies, and a steady voice in a cold doorway saying, "You don't have to name it today." "Yes," she said. "He is." Emmett looked at her with the particular attention of an older brother who has been frightened for someone he loves and is in the process of deciding whether to stop being frightened. Then he nodded, slowly, as though concluding an internal deliberation. "All right," he said. "Then I'd like to meet him properly." The following spring, when the pass road was clear again, and the high plateau had gone from white to the pale new green of early thaw, Penny and Valen were wed in the hall at Draveth, in a ceremony that was brief and plain and witnessed by Greta, Emmett, the household guard, and a collection of council representatives whose presence served the dual purpose of goodwill and formal record. Penny wore the same gray wool dress, because Greta had offered to have something grander made, and Penny had declined. Not from false modesty, but because the gray dress was the one she had worn when she walked into that council hall and stood her ground and won. And she wanted to remember that. The mill was operating again by summer, managed by a steward Penny selected herself, a woman named Orsla who had run her own holding for 20 years and knew the work from the ground up. The income went into a trust that Penny administered directly, which she had stipulated in the marriage agreement, and which Valen had agreed to without hesitation or condition. Emmett stayed at Draveth through the winter, and then went south in the spring to begin the process of rebuilding what 4 months of captivity had interrupted: his work, his connections, his ordinary life. He wrote frequently. Penny wrote back. The correspondence between them was warm, and sometimes funny, and entirely ordinary, which was exactly what they had both needed it to be. Rowan grew. He learned to walk in the great hall of Draveth, lurching from one piece of furniture to the next with the focused determination of someone who has identified a goal and intends to reach it regardless of obstacles, which Valen watched one evening from across the room with an expression so unguarded that Penny, catching it, felt something in her chest open like a window in warm weather. There was no grand reckoning with the past, no final confrontation, no dramatic last words. Aldrich's broader review concluded the following autumn, and the findings were entered quietly into the formal record, and the Fenmore name diminished steadily from the council's active affairs over the years that followed. Not dramatically, but the way things diminish when they are no longer being propped up by secrecy and advantage. It was not the ending Penny had imagined in her darkest moments, when revenge had felt like a fire she needed to burn everything down with. It was better than that, actually. It was the ending where the wrong thing was simply and permanently corrected, and she was free to turn around and face forward. She thought about her father sometimes, and the mill, and the way he had believed that what you build belongs to you. She thought he would have considered the outcome fair. She thought about that first night, the borrowed cottage, the dying fire, the knock that was 3 measured strikes and nothing more. And she understood now what she had not understood then. That the most important doors are not the ones we open when we feel ready, but the ones we open when we are frightened and exhausted and holding a fire iron and choosing to look anyway. She had looked. She had found something true on the other side of that door, and she had been careful with it, and it had been careful with her, and in the end that was the whole of the story. Not a rescue, not a fairy tale, not a debt repaid, but 2 people who had seen each other clearly in difficult light and decided, with full knowledge of the cost, to stay. That was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was everything.